Thank you very much, Lita, for that generous introduction, and welcome to all of you. Nice to see you again. It will come as no surprise to Australians, Europeans, or those of us who live in or on the fringes of the Middle East, like here in Cyprus, that we are living in an age of migration. And archaeologists have once again turned to study this phenomenon. Although the causes of migration are multiple and complex, archaeologists tend to assume a single trigger, like population growth, climate change, invasion, or socioeconomic collapse. In the case of the Philistine migration to the Eastern Mediterranean, at the end of the late Bronze Age, around 1200 BC, it is widely assumed that new or newly established settlements in the southern Levant were populated by migrants from the Aegean, if not Cyprus or Anatolia, or all three. Even accepting that some migration occurred at that time, rarely have the scholars most intimately involved in its study considered just what kind of migration it was, on what scale, and how it may have differed from other contemporary migrations in the region. Writing in 2011, Faust and Levtov summarized the migrationist narrative as seen in the archaeological literature at that time. Even today, there is still little agreement on the origins, nature, direction, timing, and the size or composition of the people involved in this proposed migration. There's also significant disagreement in identifying the basic nature of the Philistine migration, with some of the key archaeologists involved having argued that it resulted from such diverse processes as assimilation, acculturation, creolization, and so on. It is little wonder that inconsistency, contradiction, and confusion follow. One main question that arises in studying prehistoric migration concerns their size. Although exact figures are hard to come by, it is generally acknowledged that only small numbers of people were involved in prehistoric migrations. In our case, however, there seems to be little awareness of such issues. Steger, writing in 1995, for example, imagined a seaborne Philistine migration of some 25,000 people, whilst Yasser Landau, writing in 2010, envisioned an overland migration involving a minimum of 5,000 to 6,000 people. Such numbers have no basis in material, documentary, or historical reality. In my talk today, I want to take a fresh look at proposals of migration at the end of the Bronze Age in the Eastern Mediterranean. To keep within time limits, I pass over much of the background to the development of migration studies, and I leave aside some of the theoretical aspects of both migration and mobility. Instead, I present very generally the history of research related to migration and ethnicity in the southern Levant at the end of the Bronze Age, examining both the migrationist narrative and its counterpart, what we may term the mercantile narrative. I examine and critique recent studies on paleoclimatic issues, as well as the current state of evidence from paleogenetics and strontium isotope analyses. I argue that most migration scenarios envisioned for the end of the southern Levantine Bronze Age are not only idiosyncratic, but also inadequately invested in the wider archaeological, social science, and scientific literature. My conclusion, whilst ultimately inconclusive, offers an alternative view of this problematic period of transformation and change. The current revival of interest in the concept of migration is at least partly associated with post-colonial approaches, whose aim is to empower the local and indigenous whilst rebuffing the global and imperial. Many archaeologists, however, still seem motivated to demonstrate that large-scale migrations took place without considering adequately the implications of such movements and the range of possible outcomes. This is certainly the case with the so-called Sea Peoples and Philistine migrations at the end of the late Bronze Age. For our purposes here, we may define migration simply as the movement of all or part of a given population with the aim of inhabiting a new territory, separate from its origins, and with the intention of permanent resettlement in this new territory. Archaeologists typically discuss migration in the context of cultural change, but this approach focuses on the outcome, not the migration itself. It is also important to consider what triggers migration, how such movements took place, and what sort of conditions existed in the destination. As many Australians will realize, at least, most migrants do not willingly renounce their identity, ideology, or beliefs, but they must be flexible in their cultural practices. The act of migration may change the migrant's idea of home, weakening old bonds and forging new ones. Mapping material features alone cannot adequately reflect all these processes, and archaeologists must consider the effects of multiple cultural meetings and mixing on both the migrant and receiving groups. One can only marvel at the number, level, and scale of migrations envisioned for the Eastern Mediterranean around 1200 BC. It has been proposed that migrations to or within this region stemmed from as far afield as Italy in the west, the Balkans and Central Europe in the north, and thence through the Aegean, Cyprus, Anatolia, and the Levant to Egypt in the southeast, and farther within or between some of these regions. Such migrations ostensibly involve people from Italy or adjacent parts of Europe moving to Greece, Greek heroes returning from the Trojan War, sea peoples from almost anywhere in the Mediterranean moving everywhere else, Arameans moving into the Levant, and Neo-Hittites into North Syria, Syrian refugees then moving into the southern Levant and Egypt, Philistines and other sea peoples moving into the northern as well as the southern Levant, and Israelites occupying part of the southern Levant. The specific situation we're concerned with may be summarized as follows. Early in the 12th century BC, contemporary with events that followed the likely collapse of palace-based economies throughout the Eastern Mediterranean, significant changes appeared in the architecture and material culture of several sites in the southern Levant. Notably, in most towns of the Philistine Pentapolis, Ashdod, Ashkelon, Ekron, and Gath. One group of scholars, by far the majority, argues that most changes echo material traits, especially pottery, of the 13th century BC Aegean. Those traits are termed Philistine and explained as the result of an Aegean migration, perhaps linked with the wider movements and predations of the so-called Sea Peoples. This is the Philistine narrative. Another group of scholars, the minority, reject the notion of a large-scale movement of people and suggest that the material changes in question resulted from internal developments or from a broader diffusion of ideas and economic developments associated with a group of private seafaring merchants based on Cyprus and in Cilicia. This is the mercantile narrative. Amongst several aspects of material culture used to trace the origins of the Philistine are pottery, pork consumption or not, hearths and cooking pots, cylindrical loom weights, and incised scapulae, and Aegean-type figurines. Locally made pottery with some Mycenaean features has been the most prominent and is often taken as a direct marker of Aegean presence. While the nature of the arguments has become more nuanced over the past decade, it is no less contentious, and the bottom line of Philistine migration never changes. In what follows, I present in more detail the migrationist narrative, along with some of the problems it raises. The migration of Philistines from the Aegean to the southern Levant has by now become the basic paradigm of the 12th century BC. Looking back over the past 40 years, we can gain some idea of how this came about. From the time of her major monograph on the subject in 1982, Trudy Dauton was one of the most consistent proponents of the following notions, namely that the Philistines migrated from the Aegean to the southern Levant at this time, and that their material culture stemmed directly from Aegean traditions. In her view, the first appearance of Mycenaean 3C1b pottery at Ekron and Ashdod early in the 12th century BC represented the arrival of the Philistines. Based strictly on 3 phases of pottery evidence from those sites, she proposed 3 waves of new settlers, perhaps the ultimate pottery equals people approach. As already mentioned, Steger and some of his students presented one of the more extreme expressions of the mass migration of sea peoples, boatloads of war and transport ships with battalions of some 25,000 displaced Marines coming ashore in Philistia to stay. Although there is to this day no evidence for any kind of harbor installation at the site of Ashkelon, Steger maintained that the Philistines built a 50 to 60 hectare seaport that extended along the coast for almost a kilometer, and whence grain, wine, and oil were shipped to other parts of the Mediterranean. Both Gilboa and Finkelstein have pointed out the fallacy of any notion that the Philistines were ever a maritime power. Although widely cited in support of the migrationist view, the combination of fact, fiction, and imagination in Steger's study severely limits its value. Finkelstein's 2000 study argued that events surrounding the Philistine migration were longer in time and more complex than previously suggested, challenging many of the basic chronological and spatial tenets of the migrationist narrative. In a follow-up study presented as a direct challenge to the Philistine paradigm, Finkelstein decisively negated any notion of a massive maritime invasion of sea peoples, but allowed for one more limited in size. Unlike Finkelstein's more muted views, Asaf Yasser Landau has been the most vocal supporter of the notion of an Aegean migration at the end of the Bronze Age. The publication of his major monograph on the subject in 2010 nevertheless brought some theoretical balance to an area of traditionally very conservative scholarship. He proposed a massive multi-general movement of Aegean farmers and their families overland through Anatolia and then southward through the Levant. In his scenario, and I quote, Aegean aristocratic lineages continued for centuries after the migration at Tel Mekne and elsewhere. So the first question that arises from his scenario is, were they farmers or were they aristocrats? Yasser Landau estimated a migration involving a minimum of 5,000 to 6,000 people, and directly challenging Steger suggested that the nautical reality of the 12th century BC made it most unlikely that entire households migrated by boat. But how easy would it be for migrants, whether farmers or aristocrats, to move on foot or by primitive cart from any part of the Aegean world across all of Anatolia and south almost to the borders of Egypt. Yasser Landau's map of this movement is not very informative. But even if one began this journey from some easternmost point of any conceivable Aegean region, say the area around Miletus in Western Anatolia, according to Google Maps, the trip would have covered nearly 1,800 kilometers and would take some 370 hours of nonstop walking in a straight line over flat land. In reality, of course, such a trek would involve crossing harsh and often mountainous terrain in Anatolia, and then a Levantine coast of extraordinary topographic variety, with obstacles such as river mouths, promontories, sand dune, swamps, and poor road conditions. Moreover, this area was controlled by a medley of different and often hostile polities, all of which makes an overland migration seem like an impossible feat. Worse, there is no archaeological evidence to support it. If thousands of people had emigrated from Greece to Anatolia and ultimately to the southern Levant, driven by the climate or other environmental factors, why would farmers at least make the effort to move from a marginal habitat to an even more extreme semi-arid landscape? There's much more to be said about Yasser Landau's views, but no time to detail them here. Although surely Ben-Dor-Evian supports the notion of a multifaceted migration to the Levant, she takes an informed approach from an Egyptian perspective. In her view, the process of early Philistine settlement in the region, marked by Philistine monochrome pottery, assumes Egyptian involvement, directly or indirectly. Yet this scenario has been difficult to demonstrate, specifically with respect to the lack of material evidence for interaction between Egyptians and early Philistine sites. In discussing Philistine material culture, Ben-Dor-Evian noted that the monochrome pottery found in sites throughout Cilicia and the Levant has been interpreted in different ways. In the northern Levant, it is regarded as a local cultural process. But in the southern Levant, it is argued to indicate an Aegean migration. If this pottery is viewed as a localized phenomenon in the north, why should it be taken to represent migration in the south? In a recent paper, Welton et al. Suggest that these differing views regarding the same material evidence at the onset of the Iron Age in the northern and southern Levant may be attributed to the divergent scholarly traditions and intellectual histories of the two regions. Furthermore, these opposing approaches reveal crucial differences in Levantine material culture trajectories that reflect a remarkable variability in local early Iron Age societies. The study by Welton et al. Focuses on the site of Tel Tayanat, one of the largest settlements in the Iron I northern Levant, one whose range of material evidence indicates a prosperous settlement with extensive interregional connections. They argue that Tayanat was the capital of Palestine, an early Iron Age kingdom in the Amuk Plain. There is no time here to discuss how this kingdom of Palestine may or may not be linked to the Peleset of the Egyptian inscriptions and thus to the Philistines. But if it were not for the toponymic associations and the short-lived precedence of Aegean-style pottery in the Iron I northern Levant, there would be no basis for associating Palestine with the Philistines or with the Aegean in general. Welton et al. Suggest that such evidence as exists for intrusive Aegeanizing elements must be offset by equally clear evidence of continuity. Thus, the impact of the Sea Peoples should not be viewed monolithically throughout the Eastern Mediterranean. In one of his last papers, Itamar Singer discussed what he termed traditional migrationists and processual indigenists in the literature on the Sea Peoples and Philistines. Singer regarded himself as a migrationist and throughout his life argued for a sea people's migration with Aegean origins. Unlike other migrationists, however, he always sought to engage alternative views. Singer's arguments for a sea people's migration amount to a criticism of interpretations that emphasize continuity and local development. Taking into account the evidence from Tayanat, at least, we can see indisputable evidence for both continuity and change. This brief discussion of Tayanat and the northern Levant demonstrates how differently many of the same material phenomena tend to be interpreted by scholars working in different regions, with different cultural traditions in the early Iron Age Eastern Mediterranean. At this point, then, it is appropriate to shift our focus and consider alternative views on the presumed Philistine migration to the southern Levant. Anti-migrationist views have commanded much less attention than their counterparts, but are also sprinkled throughout the literature over much of the past 40 years. Drews, for example, argued that the scenes in the release from Medinet Habu in Egypt do not depict a migration at all. The images of women and children in ox cart might represent local people fleeing from a pharaonic raid rather than a mass migration. Silberman, to take another example, suggested that the image of roving invaders originated at least partly from the popularity of invasion fiction, one component of the late 19th century zeitgeist. Susan Sherritt, the most prominent anti-migrationist, suggested that Philistine monochrome pottery was produced and distributed throughout the Eastern Mediterranean by a loosely based confederation of private maritime merchants based in and around Cyprus and possibly Cilicia. In other words, it was the pottery that moved, not the people traditionally associated with its manufacture. Bauer also contested the migrationist narrative and argued that the sea peoples were a cosmopolitan bunch of freelance merchants from Cyprus and the Eastern Mediterranean, whose appearance both affected and resulted from the collapse of international trade. In his view, the material culture associated with the sea peoples reflects a mixture of the many traditions circulating in the internationalism of the late Bronze Age Mediterranean. Although Dotan had argued that the lion-headed cups found in various Philistine contexts should be viewed as what she called the last echo of a long Mycenaean-Minoan tradition of animal-headed rita, Myberg's recent public study found that while such rita appeared to be related to their Aegean counterparts, they are functionally and morphologically closer to lion-headed cups from Middle Bronze Age Anatolia and Late Bronze Age North Syria. Multiple concerns have been raised about Yasser Landau's arguments regarding cooking techniques, textile production, and cultic practices, and used to support the notion of Aegean migration. For example, given the wide variability within Philistine sites in the types, shape, and placement of hearths, not to mention their possible functions, it seems futile to argue for a single Aegean origin. Regarding loom weights, there are at least 57 sites in the Aegean and Eastern Mediterranean dating to the late Bronze, early Iron Age transition with examples. And those who have studied these objects most intensively, like Ramsdorff, feel that it is impossible to suggest any single origin. Moreover, the spool-shaped loom weights from Iron I levels at Tel Tayanat, as seen here, point to continuity with preceding late Bronze Age craft traditions. Middleton has argued that the Aegeanization seen in pottery, foodways, textile production, etc., was not a phenomenon restricted to the end of the late Bronze, but one that goes back for a century or two on Cyprus and in the Eastern Mediterranean. Von Schoenwinkel, moreover, concluded that Aegean cultural traits and artifacts were frequently altered or transformed in passage. Thus, people choose, produce, and reproduce their material culture in the ways that they acquire it. Such choices are extremely difficult to associate with ethnic, biological, or geographic origins. In another recent paper, Meyer and Hitchcock recently outlined the difficulties in trying to pinpoint the ethnic or geographic origins of the presumed Aegean migrants. Once settled, migrants have to adapt to various socioeconomic or environmental exigencies that define their new world, even if some of them acquire new meanings. At the same time, they strive to maintain various material and social facets of their old world. Such meetings and mixings of people and things might also be viewed in the trajectory of third space, one aspect of hybridization practices. Thinking about migration in terms of hybridization practices, or entanglement, or transculturation, rather than the movements of ethnic groups, enables us to consider alternative perspectives on the dynamics involved in the movement of people towards the end of the late Bronze Age in the Eastern Mediterranean. Although anti-migrationists seem to be swimming against an inexorable tide, the concerns they have raised, along with the problems outlined here, should not simply be swept aside. Those who continue to argue for a Philistine migration in the face of such objections need to address these issues directly, not simply claim that tradition justifies their stance or warrants their tendency to ignore counterviews. I turn now to consider two further issues only recently introduced into the archaeological literature concerning migrations to the southern Levant at the end of the Bronze Age: climate and paleogenetics. The study quoted at the top of the screen here, and another recent offering by two of its main authors, maintain that the years around 1200 BC witnessed extreme aridity, a century-scale episode of dry conditions that was the main factor behind what they call the huge population migrations and the decline of ancient Eastern Mediterranean civilizations. In the face of such sweeping assertions about a direct causal relation between climate crises and large-scale human migrations, one must ask once again why, if there was such widespread drought throughout the Eastern Mediterranean, any group of people would have elected to move from one drought-stricken landscape to another that was undermined by climatic stress, and so presumably was a far cry from the kind of fertile new lands in which any migrants might have wished to settle. Despite their claims of high-resolution dating, Knapp and Manning demonstrated that the dates Kaniewski et al. Provided were not only coarse, but also lacked adequate chronological resolution. Such a spuriously precise calibrated radiocarbon chronology as they proposed, with 1 to 2 centuries at best, certainly cannot be used to support the supposition of huge population migrations. And to quote Nathan Meyer, all of their studies adopt an ahistorical black box view to social change. Climates got drier and whole societies collapsed, but the actual mechanisms of change are never considered. Such problems, however, have not deterred others working in the southern Levant from calling upon paleoclimatic data to argue for large-scale or long-distance migrations. For example, in a 2013 paper, Langut et al. Identified a severe arid phase between about 1250 and 1100 BC and argued that it was the most pronounced dry episode during the Bronze and Iron Ages. Although the focus of their paper falls upon the impact of climate on collapse, not on migration per se, Their view on the latter is clear from the quote that you see on the screen. Because climatic change is a complex, multifaceted, and multiscalar issue, closer collaboration between archaeologists and climate scientists or dating specialists is essential to produce acceptable arguments. In a recent study of hydroclimatic variability throughout the Mediterranean over the past 10,000 years, Finet et al. Observed that the climate oscillated between about 4,000 and 1,000 BC, but at the end of this phase, the Eastern Mediterranean experienced what was, overall, the driest phase in the 3 millennia analyzed. In this and earlier studies, however, Finet and his colleagues have always emphasized that the proposed climatic date ranges can rarely, if ever, be resolved to the point that they can be related to social or economic crises more closely fixed in time. In another recent paper that sought to assess Holocene landscape change, Palmisano et al. Concluded, quote, it was difficult to resolve human and environmental dynamics within a 200-year resolution, and that human adaptations to climate fluctuations were beyond detection at their regional scale of analysis. And as the quote from Manning et al. On the screen indicates, they are very clear about the problems with radiocarbon dating as well as the associated paleo-environmental issues. In sum, recent discussions on modeling environmental change are critical of single cause explanations. Instead, they emphasize the complex interplay between human and natural factors in triggering anything from landscape transformation to socioeconomic collapse. In discussing an Aegean or Philistine migration to the southern Levant around 1200 BC, the tendency thus far has simply been to tack climate change onto the suite of factors argued for migration. Such views remain problematic both methodologically and scientifically. Assertions about relations between climate change and human migrations require a firmer basis with more convincing data before they can negate alternative arguments. Turning now to paleogenetics. Both strontium isotope analyses and ancient DNA hold out significant promise for identifying prehistoric migrations. Strontium analyses can provide direct evidence for the mobility of individuals, or at least make it possible to determine whether an individual was native or foreign to their place of archaeological recovery. In turn, genetics and ancient DNA can inform us at a statistical level about populations, and thus facilitate the identification of certain groups that may have been involved in prehistoric migrations. When used with reliable and statistically significant data sets within an interdisciplinary framework, ancient DNA analyses have the potential to serve as qualifying arguments for or against presumed migration episodes. Several recent studies driven by paleogenetic research, however, reveal a disturbing tendency to revive grand narratives that privilege ethnic groups as the agents of change. Although archaeologists have repeatedly deconstructed such narratives over the past century, they have resurged in several new archaeogenetic studies. Some scholars have taken these new studies based on ancient DNA analyses as a veritable transformation, the third science revolution in archaeology. Others, however, take a starkly different view, and Hackenbach, in a recent study, does not mince words in her own reaction to them, as you can see from the quote on the screen. Throughout the Eastern Mediterranean Bronze Age, the preservation of human skeletal evidence can be patchy or even non-existent. and there are still far too few paleogenetic sample sets published. Moreover, variable cultural practices like cremation may result in a situation where certain ancestries are less visible, if not invisible, archaeologically, or where their remains cannot be subjected to paleogenetic analysis. Far too much ancient DNA research assumes that identity is fixed for life at birth, that individual identities are strictly exclusionary, and that change can only come about through diffusion or migration. Much more could be said, both positively and negatively, about this new stream of paleogenetic research. I would only add that even the exponential increase in the number of ancient genomes available cannot allay anxiety over the lack of an informed framework for interpreting ancient DNA results and the failure to contextualize them better in current archaeological research frameworks. Eisenman and all make this point clearly in a recent paper. They mention the Philistines as an example of naming an archaeological culture after an historically attested and materially discernible group. Such a connection between past identities and ethnicities, however, needs closer investigation, not least because most of these identifications and the naming of the one, the material culture, after the other, historical evidence, date back to late 19th or early 20th century research practices and the prejudices that accompanied them. Let us turn now to consider the few ancient DNA or isotopic studies that might have some discernible impact on our understanding of a Philistine or any other migration episode at the end of the Southern Levantine Bronze Age. Only two published studies are directly relevant. One supports the possibility of some limited level of migration, and one argues against migration overall. Taking the former first, Feldman et al. In a recent paper extracted and sequenced ancient DNA from 108 skeletal elements excavated at Ashkelon, of which 10 yielded a sufficient amounts of human DNA for analyses. They conducted population genetic analysis on a merged data set of some 5,500 individuals, ancient and modern, as well as the genotype data of the 10 skeletal elements from Ashkelon. These then include 3 from Middle to Late Bronze Age mortuary context, 4 from early Iron Age infant burials, and 3 recovered from an Iron II cemetery next to Ashkelon city wall. These 3 groups from Ashkelon derive most of their ancestry from what is termed the local Levantine gene pool, as defined in other recent paleogenetic studies. The early Iron Age group, however, was distinct in revealing a high genetic affinity to European-derived populations, whereas the later Iron Age group revealed no signs of this European affinity. This study reveals 3 key points: a millennium-long persistence of a local gene pool made up of distinctive Bronze Age Levantine groups from the inland and coastal southern Levant. 2, a distinctive European-derived genetic composition of 4 infants from early Iron Age Ashkelon. And 3, a local Levantine gene pool for the 3 individuals from the later Iron Age. Even if we accept the European affinity of the 4 early Iron Age infants, the authors of the study acknowledge that this genetic signal was weak and can only have made a limited impact on the population of Ashkelon in the long term. Granted the potential significance of these analyses, it still represents quite a leap to go from a genetic analysis of 4 individual skeletal elements from Ashkelon to a Philistine migration of any size from anywhere. The more significant point to carry away from this study is the likely existence of the local Levantine gene pool that spans over a millennium in the Middle to Late Bronze Ages of the southern Levant. There are at least 3 other recent paleogenomic studies that also reveal a broadly homogeneous local Canaanite gene pool during the second millennium BC, but I only have time to list them here. Turning now to the second, directly related, but more problematic study, one that argues against migration, Gregorica and Sheridan analyzed human dental enamel from 543 molars recovered from a tomb at Tel Dotan. Because strontium isotope ratios and oxygen and carbon isotope values indicated that there were no immigrants among these early Iron Age interments, the authors concluded that, quote, population replacement by invading forces or foreign peoples cannot be supported by this study, end quote. The value of the study, unfortunately, is compromised by several points, not least the geographic distance between Tel Dotan and the Philistine heartland, some 75 kilometers as the crow flies. Although both authors are biological anthropologists with wide experience in the Middle East, in their study, they failed to draw upon several more relevant and more recent archaeological cases. Convincing and reliable studies into any proposed migration ideally should involve archaeologists rather than biologists or geneticists alone. There are several other studies on Levantine skeletal and faunal material more distantly related to the main issue that concerns us here, but I must pass over them for the sake of time. All of these papers, I note, set out with the a priori assumption that there was migration from Italy to Greece, from Europe to Asia and the Levant, and they seem determined to prove this phenomenon with whatever data they have on hand. To summarize, ancient DNA analysis has enabled us to ask, but all too seldom answer, questions that would never even have been raised a decade ago. It has the potential to offer extraordinary insights into past population movements. On their own, however, paleogenetic studies typically say little about the mechanisms of demographic mobility and change. They may tell us something about genetic change over time, but they cannot explain how and why these changes occur. Moreover, the size or even the order of magnitude of prehistoric migrations, not to mention a precise timetable, cannot be calculated from genetic data. So identifying mass migrations remains in the realm of the imagination. In the Levant, at the transition between the Bronze and Irons, arguments for large-scale migration often have been assembled from local evidence while overlooking the regional situation, as well as the relevance of small-scale variations for a better understanding of human mobility. Such arguments tend to see migration as a vector for change rather than as a complex phenomenon worthy of study in its own right. Scholars such as Faust that those who lived in rural sites in Iron Age Philistia cannot be regarded as Philistines because they avoided the use of pork in their diet. And further, that pork consumption represents Canaanite behavior. Thus, it seems that Canaanites and Philistines were pork eaters, the Israelites were not, and pork consumption or not represents an ethnic behavior. Sapir-Hen has recently called this argument into question, noting that pigs are never the dominant dietary component in Philistia, that the dichotomy between Iron One rural and urban sites probably results from economic rather than ethnic or climatic factors, and that the purported decline in pig consumption at Iron II sites, often attributed to the Philistines' acculturation to their new environment, is ambiguous. She concluded that pigs cannot serve as an ethnic marker in the late Bronze, early Iron Age southern Levant. Furthermore, if, as Godot has argued in a research, that material markers such as four-room houses, colored rim pethoi, and pig avoidance are dubious markers of Israelite identity, then why should circular hearths, Philistine monochrome wear, and pig usage be seen as valid material markers of Philistine identity? The hybridized Mycenaean-style pottery might well be regarded as a local development in the interconnected world of the early Iron Age Eastern Mediterranean, representing the entanglement of Canaanite and Aegean material culture, and thus not necessarily ethnic or even foreign in nature. Josephine Verducci's statistical analysis of metal jewelry from 29 sites in the late Bronze, early Iron Age southern Levant, Aegean, and Cyprus reveals a pattern of very limited Aegean influence and also calls for caution in using ethnic labels to distinguish between strong local and weaker foreign traditions in southern Levantine jewelry. The material evidence for adornment practices in early Iron Age Philistine sites, in other words, indicates clear continuities with local Levantine traditions, but reveals few attributes of non-locals or technologies. In their recent 2017 paper, Meyer and Hitchcock have suggested that the foreign traits of Philistine material culture reveal features known from Cyprus, Anatolia, the Aegean, Southeastern Europe, and beyond, suggesting multiple origins of the people who ultimately became integrated with the local Canaanite populations. They maintain that, quote, the origins of the Philistine culture cannot be explained as a monolithic migration of peoples of Mycenaean origin, end quote. The corollary of multiple origins, of course, is that there were also very likely multiple mechanisms and different vectors of mobility that brought new people to the southern Levant at the outset of the early Iron Age. Throughout the Levant, in material, social, political, and economic terms, the emergence of early Iron Age polities looks distinctively different from everything that preceded them. The contrast between the political economies of most Levantine late Bronze and early Iron Age polities is widely viewed as a new development in Iron Age state formation. All along the Levantine seaboard, from Tayanat in the north to Ashkelon in the south, archaeological evidence reveals a great deal of regional chronological variability and a multivariate material culture. Many archaeologists working in the southern Levant tend to overlook this variability and instead focus on regularities or similarities between often incongruent regional groups. Overall, however, Levantine material evidence does not point to a single uniform migratory event, but instead to multiple and variant types of human mobility that yielded distinctive archaeological outcomes. So, to conclude, there's good material evidence for sociocultural change during the late Bronze, early Iron Age transition in the southern Levant around the time of the proposed Philistine migration. Even so, a substantial change in population, not to mention a mass migration, is not evident, and there are other ways to understand these material developments, as I have tried to suggest today. The most obvious innovations were not entirely external and do not invariably point to deep change. Those that were external stem from diverse cultural traditions and from differing regions. Whereas more accurate paleoclimatic data and more fully integrated paleogenetic research hold out a great deal of promise for the future, at the present time, neither offer any resolution to the issues surrounding questions of migration to the southern Levant at the end of the late Bronze Age. The most significant point we should embrace from ancient DNA studies conducted thus far is the existence of that local Levantine gene pool spanning well over a millennium in the Bronze Age and into the Iron Age. Moreover, even if ancient DNA analyses confirmed unambiguously that some people in the late Bronze Age southern Levant had significant amounts of European or specifically Aegean ancestry, this is only one aspect of understanding who these people were, who they thought they were, and just where they might have come from. Written sources and iconographic evidence can certainly shed light on ancient migrations, but often in enigmatic or ambiguous ways. The spatial distribution of material traits, often adopted as a means of situating and identifying ethnic groups, is methodologically problematic, highly controversial, and in the end, inconclusive. As it stands, the migrationist narrative largely reflects a one-dimensional way of thinking about human mobility in the Eastern Mediterranean during the late Bronze, early Iron Age transition. The process of interaction and the mix of migrants and locals is not necessarily exceptional or even remarkable. What has been defined as migration in the case of the Eastern Mediterranean at the end of the Bronze Age is a controversial term for multiple, likely multi-generational regional or local cases of movement, entanglement, development, and demise. Thank you very much. And just in case some of you want to follow up the arguments I've made here in much greater detail, this is the book that Lita kindly mentioned in her introduction.